April 1945. Germany was dying. Cities burned beneath black clouds of smoke. Armies collapsed. Front lines vanished. And across the ruins of a fallen empire, children were being sent to war. 14, 15, 16 years old. Given rifles. Given orders. Given almost no chance of survival. They were told the British would show no mercy. They were told surrender meant shame, punishment, perhaps even death. So they prepared to fight. To the last bullet. To the last breath. But as British tanks rolled through northern Germany, something unexpected happened. Something that would stay with these boys for the rest of their lives. This is the story of fear, of survival, and of an extraordinary act of humanity in the final days of World War II. Because sometimes, the people we fear the most become the ones who change our lives forever. April 1945. Germany was collapsing. Cities burned beneath endless columns of smoke. Railway stations lay in ruins. Roads were choked with refugees pulling carts loaded with everything they had left. Across the country, church bells had fallen silent. Factories stood shattered. Entire neighborhoods had become fields of broken brick and twisted steel. The Third Reich was dying. Yet the war continued. Far to the north, British forces pushed deeper into Germany. Their tanks rolled across muddy roads. Their artillery thundered in the distance. Every day, they advanced farther into territory that only months earlier had seemed untouchable. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had lost. But in Berlin and in countless local headquarters across the country, another message was still being repeated. Fight. Fight to the last street. Fight to the last village. Fight to the last man. And if necessary, fight with children. The order sounded unbelievable. But by the spring of 1945, Germany was running out of soldiers. Millions were dead. Millions more were prisoners. Entire army formations had ceased to exist. Veteran units that once marched across Europe had been reduced to exhausted survivors desperately trying to hold collapsing front lines. There was no longer enough manpower. So the regime turned to the young. Across towns and villages, teenage boys were called upon to defend a nation that was already falling apart around them. Some were 15. Some were 14. A few were even younger. Only months earlier, many of them had been sitting in classrooms, dreaming about adulthood. They worried about school, sports, and the future. Now they were being handed rifles. The transformation was sudden and terrifying. One day they were children. The next day they were soldiers. Many had spent years in youth organizations where loyalty and sacrifice were constantly praised. They had grown up surrounded by banners, speeches, and promises of victory. They had been told that Germany was strong. They had been told that its enemies were monsters. Most importantly, they had been told never to surrender. Again and again, the message was repeated. If the enemy captures you, terrible things will happen. If the British arrive, they will show no mercy. If you give up, you will betray your country. For years, these warnings had been drilled into their minds. And now, with British troops approaching from the west, many of the boys believed every word. As darkness fell across shattered German towns, nervous teenagers stood guard at roadblocks made from rubble and overturned vehicles. They wore uniforms that often didn't fit. Some carried old weapons left over from earlier stages of the war. Others had received only a few days of training. Many had never fired a rifle in combat. Some had never even seen combat at all. Yet they were expected to stop experienced Allied armies. The task was impossible. But fear has a strange way of keeping people in place. And these boys were terrified. Terrified of the enemy. Terrified of failure. Terrified of their own officers. Terrified of what might happen if they ran. In the distance, the sound of artillery echoed through the night. Every explosion seemed closer than the last. Every passing hour brought the British nearer. Some boys tried to act brave in front of their friends. Others sat quietly, staring into the darkness. No one wanted to admit what they were really thinking. Would they survive? Would they ever see their families again? Would tomorrow be their last day alive? The answers were coming fast. Across northern Germany, British armored columns continued their advance. Village after village fell behind them. Defensive lines collapsed. Resistance weakened. And everywhere they went, British soldiers began encountering something unexpected. Not hardened veterans. Not elite troops. Children. At first, many British soldiers could hardly believe what they were seeing. The enemy firing from trenches. The figures hiding behind roadblocks. The prisoners emerging with trembling hands raised in surrender. They were boys. Some looked young enough to be in school. Some barely looked old enough to shave. The sight was shocking, because even after years of war, few had expected this. Yet for the boys waiting on the other side, the fear was even greater. They had spent years hearing stories about what would happen if they were captured. Stories of revenge. Stories of punishment. Stories of suffering. Now the moment they feared most was approaching. British tanks were coming. The war was nearly over. And thousands of frightened German teenagers were about to discover whether everything they had been told was true, or whether the truth was something completely different. What happened next would remain with many of them for the rest of their lives. The morning arrived cold and grey. A thin mist hung over the fields of northern Germany. Smoke drifted above distant villages where buildings still burned from yesterday's fighting. Somewhere beyond the horizon, artillery thundered once again. The sound never seemed to stop. For the teenage defenders scattered across the countryside, each explosion was a reminder of a simple truth. The British were coming. And they were getting closer. Along narrow country roads, frightened boys tightened their grips on rifles that felt far too heavy in their hands. Some wore oversized uniforms. Others wore mismatched pieces of military clothing gathered from whatever supplies remained. Their faces were young. Far too young. Yet they had been ordered to stand and fight. Many had received only a few days of military instruction. Some barely understood how their weapons worked. They had learned how to salute, how to march, how to obey. But war was different from training. War was chaos. War was noise. War was terror. And nothing could prepare them for what they were about to face. One teenager stood beside a roadblock made from tree trunks and rubble. He had spent the previous night imagining British tanks crushing through the village streets. Every distant engine made his heart race. He wasn't thinking about victory anymore. He was thinking about survival. Around him, other boys felt the same fear. But nobody said it aloud. Years of propaganda had taught them that courage meant silence. Fear was something to hide. So they waited. And they hoped. Some hoped reinforcements would arrive. Some hoped the British would choose another route. Some simply hoped to survive until sunset. But the war had reached its final chapter. And there would be no miracles. Then they heard it. At first it sounded like distant thunder. A low rumble. Steady. Growing louder. The ground itself seemed to vibrate. The boys exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew what it meant. Tanks. British tanks. Suddenly, reality replaced imagination. The enemy was no longer a story. No longer a rumor. No longer a distant threat. The enemy was here. Moments later, armored vehicles emerged through the mist. Large. Relentless. Moving forward with confidence built from years of combat experience. Inside those vehicles sat professional soldiers who had fought across Europe. Men who had survived Normandy, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Many of them had been at war for years. The contrast was staggering. On one side stood seasoned veterans. On the other stood boys who should have been in school. The battle that followed was often brief. Sometimes a few shots were fired before defenders fled. Sometimes resistance collapsed the moment tanks appeared. In other places, terrified teenagers attempted to fight. The results were tragic. Machine gun fire echoed across open fields. Mortar shells exploded among defensive positions. Buildings shook under the impact of artillery. The war was consuming its youngest victims. For some boys, courage and fear became impossible to separate. They fired their weapons because everyone around them was doing the same. They followed orders because they didn't know what else to do. They stayed because leaving seemed even more frightening. Yet beneath every action was the same overwhelming emotion. Fear. Pure fear. As British forces pushed forward, surrender became increasingly common. Small groups of teenagers began emerging from trenches with their hands raised. Others appeared from forests. Some walked cautiously toward British positions carrying white cloths. Their expressions revealed everything. Exhaustion, confusion, relief. Many expected shouting. Many expected beatings. Some expected death. After all, they had been told for years that surrender would lead to terrible consequences. Now they waited to discover their fate. British soldiers often stared in disbelief. The prisoners standing before them looked younger than expected. Much younger. One soldier later recalled seeing captives who seemed little older than children. The realization was unsettling. These weren't fanatical veterans. These weren't hardened warriors. These were teenagers caught inside a collapsing regime. Teenagers who had inherited a war they never started. For many British troops, anger gave way to something else. Pity. Because the faces standing before them looked familiar. They looked like younger brothers. Schoolboys. Children. And yet only hours earlier, those same children had been ordered to fight and die. The tragedy was impossible to ignore. Across Germany, the final battles continued. More villages fell. More units surrendered. The Third Reich was crumbling faster with each passing day. But for thousands of young German prisoners, a different battle was beginning. The battle against everything they believed. They had spent years hearing terrifying stories about what would happen if they were captured. Now they found themselves standing face to face with the very men they had been taught to fear. Every moment felt uncertain. Every interaction was watched carefully. Would the threats they had heard all their lives prove true? Or had they been lied to? The answer would begin revealing itself sooner than they imagined. And for many of those frightened boys, what happened next would challenge everything they thought they knew about the enemy. Because the British soldiers guarding them were about to make a choice. A choice that none of the young prisoners expected. And one that many would remember for the rest of their lives. The fighting was ending. Across northern Germany, roads that had echoed with gunfire only days earlier were now filled with long columns of prisoners. The smoke still hung over ruined towns. Burnt-out vehicles remained scattered beside highways. Broken buildings stood like skeletons against the gray spring sky. The war was not quite over. But everyone could feel its end approaching. Among the prisoners moving westward were thousands of teenage Germans. They walked silently. Some carried blankets. Some carried nothing at all. Many still couldn't believe they were alive. Only a short time earlier, they had expected to die defending villages and crossroads. Now they were prisoners of the very army they had been taught to fear since childhood. And fear still followed them. Every step of the journey brought new uncertainty. What would happen next? Would they be punished? Humiliated? Beaten? For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a terrifying image of enemy soldiers. Many of the boys genuinely believed captivity would be worse than death. Now there was no escape from the truth. Soon, they would find out. The first surprise came almost immediately. British guards did not behave the way many prisoners expected. There was no mass revenge. No random violence. No furious desire to punish every German they encountered. Instead, something strange happened. The British treated them like prisoners. Nothing more. Nothing less. The boys were searched. Registered. Given instructions. And then moved to temporary holding areas. The process was professional. Orderly. Predictable. To experienced soldiers, it may not have seemed remarkable. But to many of the young Germans, it was shocking. The monsters they had imagined did not appear. Days passed. The prisoners watched carefully. Every conversation. Every command. Every interaction. Many expected the kindness to disappear eventually. Surely, they thought, this was only temporary. Surely the cruelty would come later. But it didn't. And slowly, uncertainty began replacing fear. One teenage prisoner remembered being astonished when British soldiers shared cigarettes with captives. Others recalled receiving food without abuse or humiliation. Small moments. Simple gestures. yet powerful enough to challenge years of propaganda. For some boys, these moments created confusion. If everything they had been told about the British was true, why were these men behaving differently? The question lingered, and no one could answer it. Meanwhile, British soldiers found themselves facing their own emotional dilemma. Many had spent years fighting German forces. Some had lost close friends. Some carried memories of brutal campaigns stretching back to 1940. They had every reason to hate the enemy. Yet hatred became more complicated when the enemy turned out to be 14 or 15 years old. Again and again, British troops encountered boys who looked frightened rather than dangerous. Boys who seemed more confused than committed. Boys who had clearly been swept into a disaster far larger than themselves. One British soldier reportedly looked at a group of captured teenagers and remarked that they reminded him of schoolchildren back home. It was a realization that stayed with many veterans. Because war had blurred the line between soldier and child. The uniforms were real. The weapons were real. But so was their youth. As the number of prisoners grew, arrangements were made to transport many Germans away from the devastated battlefields. For some, that journey would eventually lead across the sea. Across the North Sea. To Britain itself. The news spread quickly among the prisoners. Britain. The very country they had been taught to fear. The reaction was mixed. Some felt relieved to be leaving the destruction behind. Others became anxious all over again. After all, nobody knew what awaited them there. Rumors spread through prisoner groups. Some claimed conditions would be terrible. Others believed they would spend years behind barbed wire. Nobody knew what to believe. The future remained hidden. As transport ships carried prisoners away from Germany, many stood on deck staring silently at the horizon. For the first time in months, some were safe. Safe from artillery. Safe from air raids. Safe from the collapsing front lines. Yet they were also leaving home behind. And that realization brought its own pain. Families remained somewhere in the ruins of Germany. Parents, brothers, sisters. Many prisoners had no idea whether their loved ones were alive. The uncertainty was heartbreaking. Still, the ships continued westward. Toward a country many had only known through propaganda. Toward a future none of them could predict. And toward an experience that would completely transform their understanding of the people they once called enemies. Because beyond the sea, behind the fences of British prisoner of war camps, something unexpected was waiting. Something that would challenge years of hatred. Years of fear. Years of lies. The boys expected punishment. What they found instead would become one of the most surprising chapters of their lives. And for many of them, the journey to Britain was only the beginning of a story they would still be telling decades later. The sea voyage ended beneath grey British skies. One by one, the prisoners stepped onto unfamiliar ground. This was Britain. The nation they had feared for years. The nation they had been taught would hate them. The nation they had imagined as the face of their enemy. Many of the teenage Germans looked around nervously. Everything felt different. The language. The buildings. The countryside. Even the air seemed different. For most of them, this was the first time they had ever left Germany. And now they had arrived not as visitors, but as prisoners of war. The trucks carried them through green fields and quiet villages untouched by the destruction they had left behind. There were no burning cities here. No collapsing front lines. No artillery shaking the ground. The contrast was almost unbelievable. Only weeks earlier, many of these boys had stood among ruins. Now they were surrounded by peaceful farmland. For some, it felt like entering another world. Eventually, the vehicles arrived at prisoner of war camps scattered across Britain. Barbed wire surrounded the compounds. Guard towers overlooked the fences. Wooden huts stretched across the grounds. At first glance, it looked exactly like what many prisoners had feared. A prison. A place where freedom ended. But appearances can be deceiving. The boys entered the camps expecting the worst. What they discovered was something very different. Life inside the camps followed strict routines. There were roll calls, work assignments, rules to follow. Yet there was also food, regular meals, shelter, medical care, things that had become increasingly rare in wartime Germany. Many prisoners were surprised by the quality of the food they received. Germany's infrastructure had largely collapsed by 1945. Shortages were everywhere. Hunger had become common. Inside British camps, meals were simple but consistent. For teenagers who had spent months living amid chaos, that consistency mattered. It brought stability. It brought relief. And slowly, it began to change perceptions. The transformation wasn't immediate. Trust takes time, especially after years of propaganda. Many boys remained cautious. They watched the guards carefully, waiting, expecting some hidden cruelty to reveal itself. But day after day, the expected horrors failed to appear. Instead, life settled into routine. The guards enforced rules, but they were not monsters. The prisoners worked, but they were not abused. And gradually, fear began giving way to curiosity. Some camps introduced educational programs. Others encouraged sports and recreation. Football matches became common. Classrooms appeared. Books circulated among prisoners. For many teenage captives, this was entirely unexpected. The war had interrupted their education. Some had left school to serve. Others had never completed their studies. Now, inside prisoner of war camps, opportunities to learn returned. It seemed impossible. Yet it was happening. One former prisoner would later remember how strange it felt to receive lessons from the people he had once considered enemies. Another recalled conversations with British civilians that challenged everything he had believed growing up. These encounters mattered, because walls don't only exist around prisons. They also exist inside minds. And many of those mental walls were beginning to crack. The boys had been told that the British hated Germans. Yet many British civilians treated them politely. The boys had been told they would face endless punishment. Yet they found structure instead of cruelty. The boys had been told they were entering a nightmare. Yet reality proved far more complicated. They were wrong. But the truth was very different. Of course, life wasn't perfect. The prisoners were still far from home. Barbed wire still surrounded them. Freedom still remained beyond reach. Many worried constantly about family members back in Germany. Letters became precious treasures. Every piece of news from home carried enormous emotional weight. Some received good news. Others received none at all. And for many, uncertainty became its own kind of burden. Yet despite these hardships, something remarkable was happening. The hatred that war had worked so hard to create was beginning to weaken. Not through speeches, not through politics, but through ordinary human interaction. A shared conversation, a football match, a respectful guard, a teacher offering knowledge. Small moments, simple moments, yet powerful enough to change lives. Months passed, then years. The war itself faded into history, but the lessons learned inside those camps remained. Many former prisoners would later speak about Britain with surprising warmth. Some even described their captivity as the period when they first began understanding the world beyond propaganda. The irony was extraordinary. The place they had feared most became the place where many rediscovered hope. But eventually, every prisoner faced the same question. What happens when it's time to go home? Because beyond the camp fences, a new Germany was emerging from the ashes. And soon, the boys who had arrived as frightened prisoners would be returning to a country forever changed by war. What awaited them there would shape the rest of their lives. And the memories they carried from Britain would never truly leave them.